You are in your late 20s or early 30s. You have a job. You might have an apartment with your name on the lease. You pay bills. You do your own laundry without being told. You stay up too late and deal with the consequences the next morning like someone who supposedly knows better. And yet, you still call your parents when you don't know what to do. You still feel genuinely surprised when someone calls you sir or ma'am. You still look around a room full of adults and experience a half-second of real confusion about when you became one of them. You still feel somewhere underneath everything like you're playing a version of House, like the real adults are somewhere nearby, and any minute now they're going to walk in and take over. You still feel closer to 17 than to 40. And 40 is not as far away as it used to be. Nobody explained car insurance deductibles. Nobody told you what a W-2 was until you needed to file one. Nobody warned you that the check engine light could mean nothing or mean everything, and that a mechanic might tell you either depending on the day. You have Googled, "Is this normal?" about your own body more times than you can count. You have eaten cereal for dinner and felt a vague guilt about it that an actual adult probably wouldn't feel. If any of that is familiar, you are not alone, and you are not broken. What you are is a 90s kid in a world that promised a very specific version of adulthood and then quietly stopped delivering it. And psychology has a precise explanation for what happens to a person in that gap. The easy version of this story is that your generation simply never grew up, that you were coddled, overprotected, given participation trophies and shielded from difficulty, that your parents hovered and left you without the tools to handle real life, that you are the Peter Pan generation, choosing an extended adolescence because adulthood looked hard and growing up felt optional. You have probably heard some version of this. You may have even believed it about yourself. But that explanation requires ignoring some very specific facts about the world you actually graduated into. And psychology, unlike a think piece published in 2014, looked at those facts. In the year 2000, developmental psychologist Jeffrey Arnett published a paper in the American Psychologist that stated something that hadn't been said clearly enough before. The transition to adulthood had fundamentally changed, not because young people were failing, because the social and economic conditions that used to make a fast, clean transition possible had quietly stopped being available. Previous generations had clear markers for adulthood: finish school, get a job that would last, get married, buy a house, have children, by 25 more or less. Those milestones were not just cultural expectations. They were genuine life events that signaled, both to the person and to everyone around them, that the transition was complete. You arrived. There was a moment where you crossed over, and everyone could see it. Arnett called what replaced that structure emerging adulthood, a new developmental stage between adolescence and full adulthood that had never existed at this scale for any previous generation. A prolonged in-between state, not arrested development. A different stage entirely, created by different conditions. For 90s kids, the specifics are precise. You graduated into an economy that had just collapsed, or into a job market where degrees cost 4 times what they cost your parents, and returned a fraction of the financial stability. You stepped into a housing market where the kind of ownership your parents had at 29 was mathematically unreachable. You entered a culture that had restructured the timeline of marriage, children, and every other milestone your childhood told you to expect by a certain age. The internal image of what an adult was supposed to look like was formed in your childhood, built from watching your parents, your neighbors, every television show you ever grew up on. By the time you were 8 years old, you had a clear picture of what grown-up looked like. And for most 90s kids, reality has not matched that picture at almost any point in their 20s or early 30s. That gap between the version of adulthood you expected and the one you actually got is where the feeling lives. In 2012, Arnett and his colleagues published the results of the Clark University poll of emerging adults, a survey of 1,000 Americans between the ages of 18 and 29. What they found was not the exception, it was the norm. 60% of respondents said they did not yet feel they had fully reached adulthood, not a struggling minority, not people with identified psychological difficulties. 60% of young adults in the precise age range this cohort was occupying said they had not arrived at the destination they were supposed to have reached. The researchers found that this sense of incompleteness was not primarily about psychology. It was primarily about structure, about the systematic absence of the milestones that, for every previous generation, had reliably signaled arrival: marriage, stable employment, home ownership, children, none of which were landing on the same timeline they once did. You did not fail to grow up. You grew up in a world where the traditional evidence of having grown up was no longer reliably available, and the part of your brain that compares your current life against the expected version, the version you built as a child watching the adults around you, has been running that comparison ever since, finding the gap and registering it as personal failure. It was not personal failure. The contract changed after you signed it. Here is what 90s kids who don't feel like adults actually are. They are people who formed a clear internal model of adulthood during childhood, and then had the intellectual honesty not to pretend they were living inside it when the conditions weren't there. The alternative would have been to claim the feeling without the substance, to perform certainty they didn't have, to stop asking questions about things they didn't understand, because adults weren't supposed to still have questions. You didn't do that. You kept asking. You kept noticing the gap. You kept feeling like you were one conversation away from being exposed, not because you were incompetent, but because the version of the role you inherited looked nothing like the version you were trained to expect. That discomfort is not immaturity. It is a form of accuracy. The people who most convincingly perform adulthood are often the people who never examined whether the performance was real. You examined it. You kept examining it. The gap never closed, so you never stopped looking. That is not the same as failing to grow up. That is what honest self-awareness looks like in conditions designed to make it uncomfortable. There is something specific about growing up in the 90s that made the gap harder to close and easier to feel. You were raised on a very particular kind of optimism. Saturday morning cartoons you had to wake up for, summers that didn't have a schedule. The specific confidence of being a child in a decade that hadn't yet been fully saturated with adult anxiety. The world had problems, but your childhood didn't show you most of them. And the warmth of that, the specific late 90s, end of the millennium version of childhood, is somewhere you still reach back toward when the present gets heavy. That's not weakness. It's not regression. It's the brain doing what it always does when the current environment feels unstable, returning to the last coordinates where it felt certain. The 90s kids who don't feel like adults aren't hiding from adulthood. They are carrying a specific version of the past forward as a reference point, the last time the world made sense on simple terms, while navigating an adulthood that is harder, more uncertain, and less legible than anything the childhood they're holding on to prepared them for. Nobody told you when you were 9 years old, watching Rugrats on a Saturday morning, that the path to the life you were watching adults live was going to be this complicated, that the timeline was going to stretch, that the feeling of arrival might not come on schedule, or might come differently than you expected, or might not come in the form you were taught to recognize. You are not behind. You are navigating a version of adulthood that didn't exist when the image of adulthood you carry was formed. That is not the same as being lost. That is the definition of adapting in real time, without a map, without the version of the destination you were promised, and without anyone giving you credit for how much that actually requires. If that describes something you've felt for years, but never had the exact words for, subscribe. The next video goes into another part of this generation's psychology that most people have lived through without hearing named properly. If this one landed, the next one will too.